The email arrived at 6:52 on a Tuesday evening, less than 2 hours before the one reserved swim window my son had left in his entire week, informing me that the community pool was closing immediately due to critical chlorine imbalance, posing an immediate health hazard. And I remember standing in my kitchen reading it while my son Elian, 10 years old, already had his swim shirt half on, already asking in the careful, repetitive way he asks things when he's anxious about a change in routine, whether we were still going, whether we were still going, whether we were still going. I told him yes, because at that point I still believed the email, and it took me exactly one phone call and 11 minutes to understand that I had just told my son a lie I didn't know was a lie yet, because the pool was not actually closing for any chemical hazard at all. My name is Farrokh Delacroix-Rosai. Elian is my son, and he has been diagnosed with autism since he was 4, along with a co-occurring sensory processing profile that makes water, specifically, one of the very few environments where his entire nervous system reliably settles into something close to calm. His occupational therapist, a patient, precise woman named Conception Ferraraboyd, explained this to us years ago in terms I still think about constantly, that for Elian, submersion and controlled water resistance provide a kind of full-body proprioceptive input that almost nothing else in his life replicates, and that consistent, predictable swim time was, in her clinical language, a core regulatory intervention rather than a recreational nicety. We live in Ashgrove Meadows, a community of about 270 homes, and for 3 years, Elian's swim time had followed the exact same structure every single Tuesday and Thursday evening, a reserved hour at the community pool during the designated, quiet hours window our previous HOA board had specifically created, at my request, to accommodate residents needing lower sensory, lower crowd swim access, an accommodation that, notably, had been formally documented and approved years earlier as a disability-related modification under our HOA's own accessibility policy. That accommodation had worked without incident for 3 years, right up until a woman named Priscilla Wentworth Hale was elected board president about 5 months before this story starts, replacing a board that had, by every account I ever heard, taken accessibility accommodations seriously and without complaint. Priscilla's tenure began the way I've since learned so many of these situations begin, with a wave of aggressive relitigation of previously settled community policies, and within her first 2 months, my quiet hours swim accommodation had become, for reasons I did not initially understand, a specific and recurring target of her attention. I want to walk you through exactly how this escalated, because the pattern matters enormously for understanding what came later. Priscilla's first move was a letter informing me that the quiet hours accommodation would need to undergo a policy review to ensure it remained consistent with fair and equitable amenity access for all residents, language that struck me, even then, as an unusually elaborate way of questioning whether my disabled son deserved 2 specific hours a week out of the pool's roughly 70 weekly open hours. I responded with documentation, Elian's diagnosis, Conception's clinical letter explaining the regulatory function of his swim time, and the original approval documentation from years earlier establishing this as a formal accommodation under our HOA's own accessibility policy, not a discretionary courtesy that could simply be revoked on review. Priscilla's response was non-committal, stating the review remained ongoing, and for about 6 weeks, nothing further happened, and I genuinely believed, based on the strength of that documentation, that this had quietly resolved itself. Then came the closures. The first one happened on a Thursday, an email arriving about an hour before Elian's swim window, citing a routine maintenance issue requiring immediate pool closure. I didn't think much of it at the time. Pools do occasionally need emergency maintenance, and I explained to Elian, who took the disruption to his routine considerably harder than I expected, that this was just an unusual, one-time thing. It was not one time. Over the following 6 weeks, this same pattern repeated itself 5 more times, always on a Tuesday or Thursday, always with a closure notice arriving within an hour or 2 of Elian's specific swim window, always citing either routine maintenance or increasingly specific chemical imbalance concerns, elevated chlorine, elevated pH, bacterial contamination risk, each notice using slightly different technical language that, to an ordinary reader, sounded like legitimate. Unavoidable pool safety concerns. I want to tell you about the toll this took on Elian, because I think it's the part of this story that made me move from confused frustration to something considerably more determined. Each cancelled swim session meant a meltdown that, per Conception's careful clinical notes tracking his regulation over that period, took progressively longer to recover from as the pattern repeated, his baseline anxiety climbing steadily as the predictability that made the accommodation work in the first place eroded week by week. By the sixth closure, Elian had started asking, before I'd even opened the email, whether the pool was going to be closed again, a question delivered with a kind of resigned, anticipatory dread that broke my heart every single time I heard it. I called the HOA management office after that sixth closure, no longer willing to accept these as isolated coincidences, and asked directly for the actual chemical testing records that had prompted each closure, since our community pool, like most, was required under County Health Code to maintain a testing log documenting chlorine and pH levels on a regular schedule. Records that, as a resident, I understood I had a legal right to request and review. What I received, about a week later, after what felt like a suspiciously long delay for a simple records request, was a stack of testing logs that on their face appeared to document exactly the chemical imbalances Priscilla's closure notices had described. Elevated chlorine on the dates matching the first two closures, elevated pH on the third, bacterial contamination flagged on the fourth and fifth. Everything appeared, at a casual glance, to be exactly what it claimed to be. I want to introduce you to my neighbor, Rosalind Enkemelu-Fairweather, who happens to hold a graduate degree in environmental chemistry and works as a laboratory quality control supervisor for a regional water testing firm, a professional background that, once I mentioned my frustration to her over coffee one afternoon, turned out to be extraordinarily relevant to exactly the problem I was facing. Rosalind offered to review the testing logs herself, and what she found, after about 20 minutes of careful reading, changed the entire direction of this investigation. Farrokh, she said, these logs are internally inconsistent in a way that suggests something's wrong. Look at this entry from the third closure, the one citing elevated pH. The reading listed here is 8.4, well outside normal range, sure. But the very next scheduled reading, less than 24 hours later, shows a completely normal 7.4, with no documented remediation action logged in between, no chemical adjustment, no shock treatment, nothing. A pH swing that dramatic doesn't correct itself overnight without active intervention. Either someone failed to document the remediation, which would itself be a compliance violation, or this reading was never actually accurate in the first place. Rosalind found similar inconsistencies across 3 of the 6 closure logs, readings that either failed to show any documented corrective action before supposedly returning to normal, or in one case, a bacterial contamination flag that, per the actual County Health Code testing protocol Rosalind was intimately familiar with through her professional work, would have required a minimum 48-hour pool closure for proper remediation and retesting. Not the single evening closure that had actually occurred before the pool reopened the very next morning. This is a pattern, Rosalind told me, spreading the 6 logs across my kitchen table. Someone is either falsifying these numbers entirely or manipulating a single test reading without ever actually treating the water, closing the pool just long enough to disrupt your son's specific swim window, and then reopening it the next day once the disruption has already happened. I think before you do anything else, you need independent verification, because if these logs are fabricated, that's not just a disability accommodation dispute anymore. That's a health code violation and potentially outright fraud, given how it's specifically timed. I want to walk you through the decision that followed, because it's the moment that turned this from a private frustration into something with real institutional weight behind it. Rosalind helped me identify our state's environmental health laboratory, the same accredited facility that county health departments themselves use for official water quality disputes, and explained that as a resident, I had standing to request an independent state inspection of our community pool's actual water chemistry, particularly given documented inconsistencies in the association's own self-reported testing logs. I filed that request the same week, along with a formal complaint to our county health department flagging the specific documentary inconsistencies Rosalind had identified. And I want to tell you, the timeline that followed moved considerably faster than I expected, largely, I would later learn. Because health departments take falsified pool safety documentation extremely seriously given the genuine public health risk involved, if a pool's actual chemical balance were ever allowed to drift as far out of range as it could if closures were being faked to disguise the absence of any real testing or maintenance happening at all. What the state lab found, once they conducted an unannounced independent inspection about 10 days later, went considerably beyond even what Rosalind and I had suspected, revealing not just a pattern of closures timed to disrupt Elian's accommodation, but something about the actual ongoing chemical maintenance of that pool that put every single family using it, not just my son, at a level of risk that none of us had any idea we'd been living with. The state inspector, a methodical man named Bartholomew Achterberg-Nwasu, arrived unannounced on a Wednesday morning, exactly the kind of surprise timing designed specifically to prevent anyone from adjusting the water chemistry in advance of an expected visit. And what he found, after a full battery of independent testing, was considerably more troubling than a handful of falsified closure logs timed around my son's swim schedule. The pool's actual chlorine levels, at the time of his unannounced inspection, were dangerously low, well below the minimum threshold required to maintain safe bacterial control, a finding that directly contradicted the HOA's own submitted testing logs from the preceding weeks, which had shown consistently normal, properly maintained readings throughout that same period. In other words, whoever had been filing those official logs records the HOA was legally required to submit to the county on a regular basis to maintain the pool's operating permit, had been reporting numbers that bore no relationship to the pool's actual condition, and had been doing so based on the pattern of the records going back several months, once the state lab pulled the full submission history. For considerably longer than the 6-week window during which Elian's swim sessions had been specifically disrupted. Bartholomew's report, once finalized, identified two distinct and troubling patterns operating simultaneously. The first was the pattern Rosalind and I had already identified, closures citing chemical imbalances timed specifically around my son's accommodated swim windows, closures that, per the actual state testing conducted that Wednesday and cross-referenced against the HOA's own submitted records, did not correspond to any genuine chemical event at all, meaning these closures had been fabricated entirely. Invented reasons deployed specifically to disrupt Elian's routine under the guise of legitimate safety concern. The second pattern, and the one that genuinely alarmed Bartholomew based on the tone of his official report, was that outside of those specifically disrupted swim windows, the pool's actual chemical maintenance appeared to have been neglected considerably more broadly than anyone had realized, with the HOA's routine testing logs showing a pattern of numbers that were, in his professional assessment, implausibly consistent, in a way that suggested someone had simply been filling in acceptable-looking figures rather than conducting actual regular testing at all, meaning the entire community, not just Elian, had potentially been swimming in inadequately maintained water for a period of months. I want to walk you through how we determined who, specifically, had been responsible for filing these falsified logs, because it turned out to matter enormously for how this entire situation was ultimately resolved. The HOA's pool maintenance responsibilities were technically contracted out to a third-party service, but the actual submission of testing logs to the county, per our community's own operating agreement, fell under the direct oversight of the board president. Meaning Priscilla herself was responsible for either personally conducting or personally verifying and submitting those records. When Bartholomew's office formally requested documentation establishing who had actually performed the testing reflected in the submitted logs, the maintenance contractor, once contacted directly by the state, provided something that resolved any remaining ambiguity immediately. Their own service records, maintained independently of anything the HOA submitted to the county, showed a testing schedule considerably less frequent than what the HOA's submitted logs claimed, and critically, showed no testing visit at all on several of the specific dates, matching the 6 disrupted swim sessions, meaning nobody, contractor or otherwise, had actually tested the water chemistry on those days. The elevated chlorine, elevated pH, and bacterial contamination readings Priscilla had cited in each closure notice had simply been invented. I filed a formal complaint with our HOA board, now armed with Bartholomew's official state report, the maintenance contractor's independent service records, and Rosalind's original analysis, identifying the internal inconsistencies that had first raised suspicion, requesting an emergency review of Priscilla's conduct and immediate reinstatement of Elian's accommodated swim schedule with a formal guarantee against further disruption. I want to tell you about the community meeting that followed, because unlike some of the more dramatic public confrontations I've heard about from other families dealing with their own HOA situations, this one unfolded with a kind of quiet, grim efficiency, largely because the state's own official findings had already established the facts so thoroughly that there was very little room left for Priscilla to argue her way around them. Bartholomew's report, formally entered into the meeting record, documented in clinical, official language exactly what had happened, fabricated chemical readings, falsified closure justifications, and a broader pattern of neglected maintenance that had put the entire community's health at genuine, if apparently accidental in that broader case, risk. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond, attempted initially to characterize the discrepancies as contractor error rather than anything she had personally done, an explanation that fell apart the moment a board member, reviewing the maintenance contractor's records alongside the actual closure emails Priscilla herself had sent, pointed out that the specific chemical figures cited in each closure notice, sent from Priscilla's own HOA email account, matched no testing visit the contractor had actually conducted on those dates, meaning Priscilla had not misreported a contractor's findings. She had generated the numbers herself. A woman near the front of that meeting, someone I didn't know well, but who I later learned had a grandson with a similar sensory processing profile to Elian's, asked the question that I think finally broke through whatever defense Priscilla had left. "Why him specifically?" she asked. "Out of every possible thing you could have targeted as board president, why did you keep closing the pool during this one specific child's 2 hours a week?" Priscilla's answer, when it finally came, was not the kind of coherent justification I think anyone in that room, including me, expected. She said somewhat disjointedly that she had believed the quiet hours accommodation was unfair to other residents who might also want low crowd access, and that she had felt the review process was moving too slowly to resolve what she considered a legitimate equity concern, language that, even taken entirely at face value, did nothing to explain why the resolution to that supposed equity concern had involved fabricating pool safety hazards specifically timed around one disabled child's therapeutic swim schedule, rather than simply proposing an expanded quiet hours policy through the normal governance process. The board voted that night, unanimously minus Priscilla's own abstention, to immediately remove her from the presidency, to formally reinstate Elian's accommodation with an explicit written protection against any future modification without documented, legitimate cause reviewed by the full board rather than unilateral presidential discretion, and to authorize a full independent audit of the pool's maintenance history going back through Priscilla's entire tenure, both to establish the true scope of the neglected chemical maintenance and to determine what corrective action and potential liability the association faced regarding the broader health and safety failure. The county health department, separately from the HOA's own internal process, pursued its own enforcement action regarding the falsified testing logs, resulting in a formal citation against the association itself for the submission of fraudulent water quality records, along with a substantial fine and a mandated period of independent third-party testing oversight extending for a full year. Ensuring the community's actual pool chemistry would be properly monitored by someone outside the board's direct control for the foreseeable future. I want to tell you what happened with Priscilla personally, because I think the ending here matters. Facing both the HOA's internal findings and the separate health department citation, along with what I understand became a fairly serious professional and social fallout within the broader community, once word of the falsified safety records spread, Priscilla resigned not just from the board, but sold her home entirely within about 5 months, moving out of Ashgrove Meadows for reasons that, unlike some other HOA disputes I've heard about, felt considerably less like a strategic settlement and more like someone who had genuinely lost the trust and goodwill of nearly everyone around her. Elian's swim schedule resumed the very week the board voted, and I want to tell you, watching him walk into that pool for his first uninterrupted Tuesday session in nearly 2 months, no anxious anticipatory question about whether it would be cancelled, just the quiet, familiar routine of putting on his swim shirt and walking down to the water, is a moment I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for. Conception's clinical notes, tracking his regulation over the following months, showed his baseline anxiety returning steadily to where it had been before the disruptions started, though she noted, gently, that it took considerably longer to rebuild that sense of predictability than it had taken to break it. A detail that still sits uncomfortably with me when I think about how casually Priscilla had been willing to gamble with his stability over what amounted to little more than her own unwillingness to follow a proper governance process. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Rosalind said to me the evening she first spread those 6 testing logs across my kitchen table, long before either of us understood how far this actually went. She said that people who falsify records to justify a predetermined outcome almost always leave small, internally inconsistent traces behind, because manufacturing a convincing lie across multiple documents, multiple dates, multiple technical readings is considerably harder than most people attempting it ever realize, and that the moment someone with the right expertise actually looks closely at the details instead of accepting the surface-level explanation, those inconsistencies tend to unravel the entire structure fairly quickly. We looked closely, and it turns out that one chemistry expert's careful eye, one accredited state laboratory's unannounced inspection, and one maintenance contractor's own independent records were more than enough to prove that Priscilla Wentworth-Hale's fabricated safety hazards had never had anything to do with chlorine levels at all, and everything to do with a disabled child's 2 quiet, predictable hours a week that she simply decided, without ever once talking to us directly, that he didn't deserve. Thumbnail text.